Ethan woke up to the sound of clanging metal and loud voices outside his window. His first thought was that the construction crew had arrived way too early. But as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and peeked through the blinds, his heart nearly stopped. His backyard is carefully maintained. Beautifully green private property had been invaded. White folding chairs were neatly arranged in rows. An arch decorated with flowers stood proudly at the far end, and a team of decorators bustled around setting up what looked like an elaborate wedding ceremony. Ethan blinked, half-con VY, and said he was still dreaming. But no, this was real. This was happening. And then he saw her, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, Margaret, standing in the middle of his yard, barking orders like she owned the place. Ethan threw on a hoodie, stormed out the back door, and marched up to her. "Margaret, what the hell is going on?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the chatter of workers. Margaret turned to him with that infuriating smug smile of hers. "Oh, Ethan, you're finally up. We were beginning to worry you'd sleep through the whole thing." "The whole what? This is my yard. Why is there a wedding set up here?" Margaret laughed, while VYing a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just for the day. My daughter's wedding, remember?" Ethan's eye twitched. "No, I don't remember because no one asked me." Margaret sighed, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. "Ethan, we sent out notices weeks ago. This is a community event. You should feel honored to be chosen for such an important day." He scanned the yard again, his blood pressure spiking. A DJ was setting up speakers near his fence. A catering van had pulled into his driveway. And was that a portable bathroom being wheeled into his front yard? "I don't care what notices you sent. I never agreed to this. Get this stuff out of my yard. Now." Margaret's expression hardened. The fake smile melted into something more menacing. "Oh, Ethan, you're making this difficult. Do you really want to be the only person in the neighborhood who ruins my daughter's special day?" Ethan clenched his fists. "I don't give a damn about your daughter's special day. This is trespassing. You have no right." Margaret raised a hand, cutting him off. "Oh, but I do. According to HOA regulations, community events can be hosted in any available space deemed suitable by the board. And guess what? We deemed your yard suitable." Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew Margaret and her band of HOA loyalists had been making up ridiculous rules for years. But this was a whole new level of insanity. "You can't just—" "Oh, but we can," Margaret interrupted sweetly. "And unless you'd like to rack up some rather hefty fines for, let's see, an unsightly lawn, unauthorized external modifications, and, parking violations." Ethan's jaw tightened. She was threatening him. She had already decided this was happening, and the so-called fines were just her way of twisting his arm. He took a deep breath. He needed to think. He needed a plan. The wedding was happening in less than 6 hours. The yard was already halfway transformed into a venue. The caterers were unloading trays of food. The florist was draping flowers over everything in sight, and a group of giddy bridesmaids were taking selfies by his koi pond. Ethan stormed back into his house and slammed the door shut. His brain was on fire. There had to be a way to turn this around. If Margaret wanted a war, she was going to get one. He picked up his phone, considering his options. The police? No, Margaret had made sure to wrap this whole thing in enough bogus HOA red tape to make it look official. He needed something faster, something that would ruin this wedding before it even began. Then, as he stared out the window at the pristine white tablecloths and delicate floral arrangements, an idea hit him, a wicked, brilliant idea. His property had an old underground sprinkler system, one he never used because the water that came out was disgusting rusty, murky, reeking of iron and dirt. It was a remnant of the old plumbing system that had been replaced years ago, but the pipes were still there, waiting. A slow grin spread across his face. Margaret wanted a wedding in his yard? Fine. She would get exactly what she asked for. Ethan wasted no time. He headed to the garage, pulled out his toolbox, and got to work. If everything went according to plan, this wedding was about to become the biggest disaster this neighborhood had ever seen. Ethan paced in his kitchen, gripping his coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping him from throwing something. He had spent years dealing with the nonsense from Margaret and her HOA minions. But this was on a whole new level of insanity. She had turned his backyard into a full-blown wedding venue without his permission. And the worst part was, she knew exactly how to manipulate the system to make sure she got away with it. He had to be smart about this. He had to hit back in a way that would make sure she never pulled something like this again. The sound of laughter outside made his blood boil. He peeked through the blinds, watching as a group of bridesmaids posed in front of the arch that had been set up near his fence. A few of them even had the audacity to wave at him, completely oblivious to the fact that he had never agreed to any of this. The caterers were setting up tables, lining them with expensive-looking dinnerware, while a DJ was testing the sound system near the porch. His yard looked like something out of a bridal magazine, and yet he was the only person in this entire equation who hadn't been consulted. His phone buzzed. It was Alex, one of the few reasonable people in the neighborhood. "Ethan," Alex sighed as soon as he picked up. "I heard about what's happening, man. I don't even know what to say. You could start by telling me how Margaret thinks she can get away with this." Ethan snapped. Alex hesitated. "Look, you know how she is. She twisted the HOA rules just enough to make it seem like she's within her rights. She bullied the board into approvying this. And if you try to fight it, she'll probably hit you with so many fake violations you won't know which way is up." Ethan rubbed his temples. He already knew that much. Then I need to do something she can't argue with. Something legal, but something that'll ruin this whole thing. There was silence on the other end for a moment before Alex spoke again, lowering his voice. "You didn't hear this from me, but I found out something interesting. Margaret didn't just choose your yard because she thought it was pretty. She chose it because she spent the HOA's event fund on herself. There was supposed to be a real venue, but she blew the budget on personal expenses, so she made up some HOA nonsense to force you into this." Ethan felt his grip on the phone tighten. Of course she had. The level of entitlement was unbelievable. But now he had an angle. Margaret wasn't just being a tyrant. She was covering up her own mistakes. "Thanks for telling me," Ethan muttered. "Now, I just need to make sure this wedding doesn't go as planned." He ended the call and turned back to the window, his eyes locking onto the sprinkler system controls in the garage. That nasty old water had been sitting in the underground pipes for years. One flick of a switch, and his entire yard would turn into a swamp of rusty, muddy chaos. But he needed to time it perfectly. If he did it too soon, Margaret would find a way to recover. He had to wait until just the right moment when everything was set up, when the guests were settled, when the bride was about to walk down the aisle. He had to make sure it was a disaster Margaret would never forget. As he was planning, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find a man in a tuxedo standing there, looking a little uneasy. "Hey, you must be Ethan," the man said. "I'm Daniel. I'm the groom." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You're the guy marrying Margaret's daughter?" Daniel scratched the back of his head. "Yeah. Look, I just wanted to say I had no idea she was doing all this. I thought we had a real venue booked. I didn't even know this was someone's private property until this morning." Ethan studied him for a moment. He seemed genuine. "So you're saying Margaret lied to everyone?" Daniel exhaled. "I'm saying I wouldn't put it past her. She's been controlling every detail of this wedding. Emilimi Fianza wanted something small, but Margaret turned it into this. And now I'm standing in a stranger's doorway, apologizing for something I didn't even do." Ethan crossed his arms. "You realize you're about to marry into this, right?" Daniel gave a dry laugh. "Trust me, I've been having second thoughts." He ran a hand down his face. "I just wanted to say I get why you're mad. If I were you, I'd be losing my mind." As much as he wanted to hate everyone involved in this, he couldn't help but feel a little sorry for the guy. "Well, you're not wrong." He glanced past Daniel to see Margaret on the other side of the yard, directing more vendors like a dictator overseeing a kingdom. His frustration flared up again. "Look, man, I appreciate you coming over here, but this wedding is a complete joke, and I'm not just going to sit back and let her walk all over me." Daniel nodded. "Fair enough. Whatever you're about to do, maybe don't destroy the whole wedding. Emily doesn't deserve that." Ethan considered that for a second, then he shrugged. "No promises." Daniel sighed, but didn't argue. He just gave Ethan a nod and walked back toward the chaos. Ethan shut the door and checked the time. 2 hours until the ceremony started. That gave him just enough time to fine-tune his plan. He grabbed his toolbox and went out to the garage, making sure everything was ready. He wasn't going to flood the yard just yet. No, he was going to wait. He was going to let them think everything was going perfectly. Then, right when Margaret thought she had one, he was going to make sure this wedding became the single worst event in HOA history. The sun was shining, the guests were REVYing, and the wedding was coming together exactly as Margaret had NVY signed it, except for one small detail. The man who actually owned the yard was watching from his window, waiting for the perfect moment to turn this dream event into an unforgettable nightmare. Ethan sipped his coffee, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had checked everything twice. The rusted sprinkler system was ready, the water was primed in the underground pipes, and the moment Margaret felt like she was on top of the world, he was going to flip the switch. Outside, laughter and chatter filled the air. The groom's side of the family was seated, making polite small talk, unaware of the disaster that was about to unfold. The bride's side was another story. They were loud, obnoxious, and almost as entitled as Margaret herself. A group of middle-aged women in expensive dresses complained about the humidity, fanning themselves dramatically. A few children ran around, completely unchecked, stomping through Ethan's flower beds as their parents ignored them. Ethan's fists clenched when he spotted Margaret at the front of the yard, greeting people as if she were the queen of a royal gala. She smiled, laughed, and acted as though she personally owned the entire neighborhood. She hadn't even glanced at Ethan's house, confident that he had been defeated. It was almost funny how easily she believed she could get away with this. The music started. The DJ set up near the fence cranked up some soft romantic tune as the procession began. The bridesmaids made their way down the makeshift aisle, each one stepping carefully to avoid the uneven patches in the yard. The audience watched, their expressions warm and sentimental. Everything was going perfectly. Ethan's hand hovered over the switch. Not yet. He had to time this just right. Margaret stood near the front, beaming with pride. Her daughter, Emily, was about to make her grand entrance. The guests stood up, turning their heads in anticipation. The music swelled. The moment had arrived. Ethan flicked the switch. It started as a quiet gurgle at first. No one even noticed. Then, with a sudden hiss, the underground pipes released years of trapped, stagnant water. The sprinklers burst to life, spewing dark, murky liquid in every direction. The first few rows of guests were hit instantly, shrieking as their expensive outfits were soaked in brown, foul-smelling sludge. The water gushed from the ground in erratic sprays, covering the perfectly decorated chairs, the pristine white tablecloths, and the towering wedding cake. Chaos erupted. The DJ's speakers sparked and died as water splashed over the electrical equipment. The bridesmaids screamed, clutching their dresses as they scrambled to escape the flood of filth. Elderly guests stumbled backward, slipping in the quickly forming mud. The pristine white aisle was now a swamp, and the carefully arranged flower petals turned into soggy clumps of disaster. And then came the bride. Emily stepped into the yard, ready for her big moment, only to be met with complete pandemonium. Her white dress, once pristine and glowing, was instantly ruined as she stepped directly into a puddle of sludge. She shrieked, lifting the fabric, but it was too late. The bottom half of her gown was stained beyond repair, the lace soaked in rust-colored water. Ethan stood at his window, watching the scene unfold with pure satisfaction. But the real show was just beginning. Margaret's face went from blissful joy to absolute horror. She stormed toward the sprinkler system, slipping on the wet grass, barely catching herself. She whipped around, her expression full of rage, scanning the yard until her eyes locked onto Ethan's house. Ethan stepped onto his back porch, crossing his arms as Margaret stomped toward him, mud splattering her heels. "You did this!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at him. Ethan shrugged. "Oh, I don't know what you mean. Seems like a plumbing issue. Maybe you should have picked a real venue instead of stealing someone's backyard." Margaret's hands curled into fists. "You ruined my daughter's wedding." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" Because last time I checked, you never had permission to use my yard in the first place. Emily, now on the verge of tears, turned to her mother. Mom, what is he talking about? Margaret stammered, glancing at the guests who were now whispering amongst themselves. Some of them had pulled out their phones, recording the chaos, eager to capture the scandal unfolding before them. Ethan smirked. Oh, you didn't tell them? You didn't tell your daughter that this wasn't actually a venue? That you didn't even bother to book a real place because you spent the HOA money on yourself? The crowd gasped. Margaret's face drained of color. Emily's expression shifted from heartbreak to fury. You told me everything was taken care of. You said we had a beautiful outdoor venue booked. Margaret floundered. Sweetie, you lied to me. Emily's voice cracked. You used someone's private property. You didn't even ask him. By now, the groom's family was edging away from the bride's side, their expressions full of disgust. Daniel, the groom, stepped forward, shaking his head. Wow, this just keeps getting worse. He turned to Emily. You knew your mom was controlling, but this is insane. Emily's lip trembled. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I need to think. I need a second. He turned and walked off, Leah VYing Emily standing alone, her ruined dress clinging to her legs. Margaret, seeing everything spiraling out of control, desperately tried to regain command of the situation. All right, everyone calm down. We can fix this. We'll just move the wedding inside. Ethan chuckled. Inside? You mean into my house? That's cute. Get off my property before I call the cops. Margaret's eyes burned with rage, but she had no choice. She turned, trying to salvage what little was left of the event, but it was useless. The guests were already Leah VYing, murmuring amongst themselves about what a disaster it was. Ethan watched with satisfaction as the wedding fell apart before Margaret's eyes. The expensive decor was ruined, the guests were furious, and worst of all, her secret about the HOA funds was now out in the open. As the last few guests trudged away, Margaret shot Ethan one final glare. You'll pay for this. Ethan smiled. I think you already have. With that, he turned, stepping back into his house, Leah VYing Margaret standing in the muddy wreckage of what was supposed to be her perfect day. The next morning, Ethan stood in his backyard, surveying the aftermath of the greatest disaster in neighborhood history. The muddy water had mostly dried, Leah VYing behind patches of brown stains on the grass and ruined decorations scattered across the lawn. A few wilted flowers were still clinging to the wedding arch, which was now leaning at an odd angle, like a relic from a war zone. Pieces of broken plates and soggy napkins littered the ground, remnants of a celebration that never really happened. The wedding was over, the HOA was in chaos, and Margaret She was nowhere to be seen. Ethan sipped his coffee, enjoying the silence for the first time in years. There was no HOA threat looming over him, no Margaret sneering from across the street, no ridiculous fines showing up in his mailbox. The wedding had not only exposed Margaret's corruption, but had finally given the entire neighborhood the push it needed to turn against her. No one had sympathy for her after the spectacle she had caused, and after the police started asking questions, it was clear that her reign was officially over. He chuckled as he remembered the moment Margaret had realized she was losing control, the way her face had twisted in horror when the police car pulled up, the sheer panic in her voice as she tried to smooth over the situation. But there was no smoothing over a full-on fraud investigation. The other HOA board members had already begun distancing themselves from her, making sure to remind everyone that they had no idea she was misusing funds. Alex had promised Ethan that a full audit was coming, and it wasn't looking good for Margaret. The best part? The HOA had called for an emergency meeting to discuss the possibility of dissolving altogether. After years of suffering through Margaret's ridiculous rules and petty fines, the homeowners had finally had enough. With the scandal unfolding and Margaret's iron grip on the board shattered, people were starting to realize that they didn't actually need an HOA at all. The whole system had been Margaret's personal tool of control, and now that she was gone, it was only a matter of time before the entire thing collapsed. Ethan walked to his fence, looking across the street at Margaret's house. The curtains were drawn, the front yard eerily quiet. Rumors were already spreading that she was planning to sell her house and leave town before the audit could catch up with her. He wouldn't be surprised. Margaret was many things, but she wasn't the type to stick around and face the consequences of her actions. As he turned back toward his house, he noticed someone standing in his driveway. Daniel, the almost groom, with his hands stuffed into his pockets, looking tired but surprisingly calm. Ethan nodded toward him. "Didn't think I'd see you around here again." Daniel gave a short laugh. "Yeah, well, I needed some closure, I guess." He looked around the yard, shaking his head. "Man, this place got wrecked." Ethan smirked. "You should have seen it last night. The mosquitoes were HOA-ing a feast. I think one of them carried off a bridesmaid." Daniel snorted. "Honestly, I don't know whether to thank you or be mad at you. You ruined the wedding, but you might have saved my life." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "So, it's officially over?" Daniel nodded. "Emily tried to call me this morning, but I think we both know it wouldn't work out. Last night was a wake-up call. Her mom has controlled every part of her life, and if I had gone through with that wedding, I would have been stuck dealing with Margaret for the rest of my life. I don't think I could survive that." Ethan chuckled. "Probably not. She'd have HOA rules for your marriage. Section 5B. Husband must agree with wife's mother at all times or be fined accordingly." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, exactly." He hesitated, then looked at Ethan more seriously. "I know you didn't do what you did for me, but thanks. I think you saved a lot of people from a nightmare." Ethan shrugged. "I just wanted my yard back. Everything else was just a bonus." Daniel nodded, looking thoughtful. "So what happens now with Margaret?" Ethan smirked. "Oh, I think she's done. The HOA is falling apart, the board is turning on her, and she's got the police breathing down her neck. If she doesn't skip town, she's going to be in a whole lot of trouble." Daniel let out a breath. "Good. She deserves it." He paused, then gave Ethan a grin. "So what's next for you? Going to start renting out the yard for real weddings?" Ethan laughed. "Yeah, right. I think I've had enough of that for one lifetime." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, if you ever change your mind, maybe consider charging next time." Ethan smirked as Daniel walked off, shaking his head. As much of a disaster as the whole thing had been, it was satisfying knowing that he wasn't the only one who had walked away from it with a win. Later that evening, as the sun started to set, Ethan sat on his porch, enjoying the peaceful quiet of the neighborhood. It was funny, after all the chaos, after all the fighting, after everything Margaret had done to make his life miserable, it had all come crashing down in a single night. He had spent years dealing with her ridiculous rules, dodging her fines, pushing back against her nonsense. And in the end, all it had taken was one over-the-top wedding and a little bit of dirty water to finally bring her down. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly relaxed. And then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A message from Alex. "HOA meeting tomorrow. Final vote on whether we're disbanding. Should be interesting. Bring popcorn." Ethan grinned, shaking his head. Oh, he'd be there. After everything he had been through, there was no way he was missing that. As he put his phone down, he noticed movement across the street. Margaret's front door opened, and for the first time since the disaster, she stepped outside. She looked around cautiously, as if she expected someone to jump out and confront her. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, despite the fact that the sun was nearly down, and she clutched her phone tightly in one hand. She hurried to her car, looking around nervously before getting inside and starting the engine. Ethan watched as she pulled out of the driveway, her tires screeching slightly as she sped off down the road. He wasn't sure where she was going, but he had a feeling it wasn't just a quick trip to the store. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair again. Maybe she was finally gone for good. He took another sip of his drink, staring at the darkening sky. Peace at last, at least until the next neighborhood disaster. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the community center for the HOA meeting. The room was packed with homeowners, all buzzing with anticipation. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of anger, relief, and curiosity. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Alex greeted him at the door with a grin. "You ready for this?" Ethan smirked. I've been ready for years." They took their seats as the meeting was called to order. The board members, looking nervous and uncomfortable, took their places at the front of the room. Margaret was noticeably absent. The president of the HOA, a man named Richard, stood up and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, we've had some unfortunate events recently. There have been allegations of misconduct, misuse of funds, and a general breakdown of trust within our community." The room erupted in murmurs. Richard held up a hand to quiet them. "We've conducted a preliminary investigation, and while we can't go into specifics, I can tell you that the allegations are serious. As a result, we've decided to call for a vote on whether to dissolve the HOA altogether." The murmurs grew louder. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. Richard continued, "This is a big decision, and we want to make sure everyone has a chance to voice their opinions. So, we'll open the floor for discussion before we vote." One by one, homeowners stood up to speak. Some were angry, recounting years of frustration with Margaret's tyrannical rule. Others were relieved, eager to be free of the HOA's oppressive regulations. A few were hesitant, worried about what would happen to the neighborhood without an HOA to enforce rules. Ethan listened quietly, his mind wandering back to the chaos of the wedding. He had done it. He had taken down Margaret and exposed her corruption. Now, it was up to the community to decide what came next. Finally, Richard called for a vote. "All in favor of dissolving the HOA, please raise your hand." Ethan raised his hand without hesitation. He looked around the room, watching as more and more hands went up. It was a landslide. Richard nodded. "The motion carries. The HOA is officially dissolved." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. Finally, it was over. As the meeting adjourned, Alex clapped him on the back. "You did it, man. You took her down." Ethan shook his head. "We all did. It was a team effort." Alex grinned. "Yeah, but you were the one who started it. You're a legend." Ethan laughed. "I don't know about that. I just wanted my yard back." As they walked out of the community center, Ethan felt a sense of closure. The nightmare was over. Margaret was gone, the HOA was dissolved, and he could finally enjoy his home in peace. But as he looked around the neighborhood, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Without the HOA, would the neighborhood descend into chaos? Or would it thrive, free from the oppressive rules and regulations that had plagued it for so long? Only time would tell. But for now, Ethan was content to sit back, relax, and enjoy the peace and quiet. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to settle into its new normal. Without the HOA, homeowners were free to make their own decisions about their properties. Some took advantage of the newfound freedom, painting their houses bright colors or adding quirky decorations to their yards. Others preferred to keep things simple, maintaining their homes as they always had. Ethan's backyard was finally his again. He spent his weekends tending to his garden, enjoying the peace and quiet that had been so hard to come by in the past. The koi pond was thriving, and the flowers were in full bloom. One evening, as he sat on his porch sipping a beer, he noticed a familiar figure walking down the street. It was Daniel, the almost groom. He looked happier, more relaxed than Ethan had ever seen him. Daniel spotted Ethan and waved, walking up to the porch. "Hey, Mun, how's it going?" Ethan smiled. "Not bad. You?" Daniel shrugged. "Better. Emily and I were not together anymore. But it's for the best. I think we both needed a fresh start." Ethan nodded. "I get that. Sometimes you just have to let go." Daniel looked around the yard. "You've done a great job cleaning this place up. It looks amazing." Ethan chuckled. "Thanks. It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it." Daniel hesitated, then said, I've been thinking about what you did. Taking down Margaret, standing up to the HOA.it was pretty brave." Ethan shook his head. "I wasn't trying to be brave. I was just tired of being pushed around." Daniel smiled. "Well, whatever the reason, you made a difference. The whole neighborhood is better off because of you." Ethan felt a warmth in his chest. He hadn't set out to be a hero, but it was nice to know that his actions had made a positive impact. As the sun set and the neighborhood grew quiet, Ethan and Daniel sat on the porch, sharing stories and laughing about the absurdity of it all. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was part of a real community, not one ruled by fear and control. And as he looked out at the peaceful street, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.